Let's answer the title right off the bat. Why are there no good VR games? The reason there are no good VR games is because people serious about VR, the ones willing to pour the time and effort required to make a game, aren't making games. Instead, they're making training data, medical simulations, architecture diagrams. They're working at Microsoft and Google, focusing on stuff like AR simulations for the military and VR pilot programs. People who can foot the bill for the VR aren't making games because games aren't where VR shines, and I think you know that. That's all you came here for, then you can leave, but I'm going to go into a little more detail from kind of a development perspective, since I've spent the past year working on a commercial VR application with a team, and the last 6 years working in team-based agile-led software development, which is generally speaking the development framework that a lot of these teams making VR applications are using. So without further ado, let's get started. Kiss for you. The first thing you need to know when trying to understand why I might come to a conclusion that it's not really about the games themselves, but actually more so about the climate around virtual reality is the kind of fact that you have to look at it from a development perspective, which I'm going to try and do here. I'm going to go into a little bit sort of the context around how these things are developed from someone that has kind of, gathered some experience in it, working in a VR application for a little bit here. Virtual reality development is very similar to other kinds of development you might see when it comes to computer science or data science applications. And that's basically to say, when you get into this realm, we're using a lot of code and you're using a lot of kind of abstract concepts. There's two things you really got to keep in mind when you're trying to understand what it is from like a consumer side. And those two things are your ability to create solutions from nothing and your ability to get help. And those two things are pretty intertwined, and I'll explain as we're opening up the project here. So the first part is when you're doing stuff in either a programming language or in general development, ultimately what you were doing when you have to get good at is making a solution from nothing, right? A lot of the time you do not have the scaffolding, the framework, or anything to really help you create the solution you're looking for. The only thing you really have is the knowledge that you need to make something work, right? And so a great example of that is this scene here, right? So I was tasked with, basically me and my team were tasked with recreating a submarine in virtual reality so that the people that are claustrophobic or injured or elderly or anything like that can experience the submarine as the people could normally, except with the addition of it being, not as claustrophobic feeling and not as restrictive, because obviously one of the main reasons they couldn't go on the actual thing is because of those problems, so we want to kind of eliminate that. And obviously, this is the kitchen, example of the kitchen, and so we kind of just make more space and put things around here and all that. And our ultimate goal is to, make this as feeling like it's the actual kitchen without, some of the problems. So when we first got this model, it was just that, a model, right? I can, move around using the arrow keys in this case, and you'll see that, you have a table and some chairs and all that, and then you have, the drawers and stuff. And once you put on the headset, and I click play here, and I, put on the headset, and you're able to walk around and stuff, what you quickly realize is that without any collision, right, with basically just think of this as like a giant 3D image, right? Without any collision, without any physics attached to it, you can just walk right through stuff. You can walk through walls and tables and doors and all that. And my job in creating this is figuring out, how do I add collision? How do I, create the ability for you to pick up this cube and create the ability for you to open these drawers and for you to, go to the next room and for you to, walk around here functionally. And so you might have an idea of, how do I do that? But ultimately, that idea is going to be restricted by your development environment. In this case, I'm using Unity, so I have to look up tutorials relating to Unity and VR. Then I have to figure out, okay, what project settings am I working with? In this case, we'll just go to project settings, and we'll see that we are using XR Interaction Toolkit by Oculus in the Unity VR. So that's important to know. We're also using a specific version of Unity, right? In this case, we're using the 2021 3.10. If we're looking at anything, beyond that, like newer versions of Unity, the tutorials there might not work. We also have to look at stuff like what kind of framework for our VR development are we using. For interaction, we're using the default toolkit, but for things like actual development, we're using OpenXR, which is a open source platform to basically allow you to export this onto devices, right? And this has a specific version, and so certain things might be available on that version that aren't available in older versions and stuff. And all this doesn't have to necessarily be on the same thing. So what we ended up doing was having this version of Unity stay the same, but we updated our OpenXR framework so that we could have more features on some of our components, right, for just simplicity, right? So instead of having to code a bunch more stuff, for example, like being able to grab something with two hands, that's kind of difficult in an older version of this framework, but in a newer version that we updated to, it's much easier, and I'll show that in a sec. But all those things are kind of things you have to understand when you're going and trying to find tutorials. A lot of tutorials might not have the correct OpenXR version, for example, that we're using, and so those tutorials don't necessarily apply. So that's what I really mean when I say we're creating a solution from nothing, is that you kind of have to, unless you have a pretty general case, most of your solutions are coming from a general logic point that someone else has made, some tutorial or some forum post or something's talked about, but you're going to have to adapt it to your specific situation, and that's quite difficult, especially when a lot of the solutions that you come up with are predicated on that logic, and then you make more solutions on top of that that kind of link back to it. Because a lot of the time, this kind of code and this kind of development is built upon each other. One thing works, that's great. What happens when you have to build upon that? And I have a pretty good example here. I took one of my coding examples. If you know the Mancala game, basically you just have a little board, and you're able to put different marbles in it across the thing. And so one of our assignments was making a Mancala game. And part of it is obviously making the ASCII art that goes around it to, create the board and, make the game and have people, select pits and do all that. And one thing is that all you're given for instructions is, hey, make the ASCII code or you make a function that makes the ASCII code to go around the board, and then make a way for people to select a pit and, that kind of thing. And so what I ended up doing, this is like a multi-week thing, right? But ultimately it ended up being, 700 lines, which isn't, a great indicator, but it ended up being pretty long. And it's ultimately based upon functions here. And the logic of these functions working is dependent on the other functions I made also working. So for example, when you have all the ASCII art and all the ASCII characters and stuff, right here, when you have to build it. So the example, if I can, this is kind of blocking, but you can see at the bottom here, the example is that you have this board and it's like 1 and 2, and it's all labeled, has X's and all that stuff. The X's here, and the letters and stuff are obviously in between these little marks. So you basically have to go line by line, right? And you can't just say, oh, I want to add an A right here in the middle of this ASCII. You kind of have to build into it. So basically, what you get is the default board, which just looks like this. And then when you have to build in and change these numbers, you have to do it line by line and rebuild the board. And so that rebuilding process has to happen. You basically have to make a system. In this case, I used a 3D matrix. I'm not going to bother explaining it, but fundamentally, I used a 3D matrix of multiple points to basically build out a labeling system, and then track that labeling system so that when someone got a specific pit, it would label that, and it would predict the next pit that they need, so it can keep track of it. And you basically did that so you could build the ASCII, right? But if my building of the ASCII wasn't solid and wasn't correct every time, my functions wouldn't work. And so that's kind of what you end up realizing here, is that if all this didn't work, then the main thing you're doing isn't going to work. And this is mostly just trial and error, right? Figuring out what works, what doesn't work, where can you adapt your program, kind of seeing if there's tutorials around it. But ultimately, at this point, you're so entrenched into it that you can't really get out that easy. And so if you're trying to do this, you just have to, kind of bug fix and bug test and, try different scopes and all that to kind of see where you can get yourself out of this situation, ultimately, right? And it's all based on things you wrote. And so you hope your original logic is good enough so that your next logic can kind of work through that. And the reason I kind of mentioned that, and hopefully that sort of made sense, because I mentioned that that's basically what you have to do for VR development. And I'll give you a great example. So this cube here, right? We have a cube. In this case, this is just your interactable. I don't really have time to explain how the Unity engine works, but fundamentally, you have a cube here, and you have all these things. Basically, these are just like components that you can add. And obviously, a good component is a box collider. This basically just gives you a collision box around whatever you're looking for. In this case, it's a cube, so you don't have to worry about changing it. But you have this, and then that gives you basically a collision, so that you have the ability for it to collide with other objects, right? Because that's obviously important. You don't want this to be falling through stuff. So you have a box collider. You have rigid body, which is basically just saying, hey, I want this to be a solid object, if it has gravity or not. And then you have all these scripts that are either pre-done or not pre-done, depending on the setup here. And these allow things like being able to grab the object. So that's this one. Setting it up with an interaction manager, setting up how you want to grab it, setting up if you want to track the position or not, or the rotation, what happens when you throw the object. The secondary attach is the thing I was talking about with setting up multi-hand. So like right now, if I grab this object, I'm going to be able to grab it with one hand and not the other hand, because I don't have the secondary attach and the attach transform enabled. And that basically lets me do, so if I had, attach transform at like this corner here and second attach at the other corner, I'd only be able to pick up the cube on those two corners that I set up. And that's something that you wouldn't have the ability to do as easily by just, clicking this button if you were in an older version of OpenXR. So that's kind of the reason that when you're trying to say, oh, how do I enable, if I look up how do I enable multi-grab on an object in Unity VR, and it'll tell you a bunch of things that you don't have to do if you're on a later version. You can just, go over here, right? So that kind of brings back to the point one of, trying to make a solution from nothing and adapting what you need to do. It's all about figuring out what you can accomplish, what you can't accomplish, trial and error your way through these solutions that you kind of build upon itself. And so one thing you may have a question is like, okay, if it takes a long time to do this and set this up and all that, why are you saying that this necessarily isn't something that people would want to go through and do? Because, just because something's hard and just because it's not, super easy and doesn't make a ton of money doesn't mean people aren't doing it, right? There's still VR games being made and all that. And my main sort of point there is the people that are able to do this and do it effectively aren't working on game development. They're going to be working on higher end applications, which brings me to talking about the HoloLens. A lot of people forget that the HoloLens is a real thing that is active and is being worked on and worked with in a lot of situations. And the one I want to highlight, so we don't spend 4 hours on this, is healthcare. There's a lot of benefits to this, and the main ones are remote assisting, so able to kind of FaceTime or whatever Microsoft is doing with other colleagues in the healthcare sphere, and basically talk about patient records and get X-rays, as you can see right here, with the other people. There's also doing collaborations with your 3D avatars, looking like this. Also with these patient data and stuff, as well as I think these are basically all just saying the same thing in different kind of sections, but it's ultimately, hey, improving collaboration between the people, and then more importantly, having guides, step-by-step stuff showing a human skull and a human spine and how to move that. And then obviously what you've seen before is the ability to make 3D hologram and gain perspective into the human body by doing tests and training. And so you're able to show like, oh, here's a heart and here's where it is and all this stuff, and as well as learning for diagnosis and real treatments. Also with the human skeleton, basically having this appear and you can move it and all that, as well as patient engagement through walking them through a 3D model. So instead, if you have to explain like a surgery or something, and it's like you really need to understand what they're doing, the patient could put this on and see, oh, we're going for this part of your brain, right? That's kind of ultimately where they're going for this. And this is through the HoloLens too, right? They have a whole page dedicated to how it's helping with healthcare. And it looks like HoloLens 2, the Industrial Edition, and the other edition. Yeah, so it's about $3,500, $5,000, $5,200, around that. HoloLens 2 Plus, a ISO and designated class, and some certifications, and a 2-year warranty. So the base model is 3500, which is about the same as like an Apple Vision Pro. And then the industrial has a bunch of certifications, regulated environments such as clean room and hazard locations. This is probably for obviously when you're using it for more hazardous or industrial things versus like this can be used for medical. I would think. And then this is obviously for construction zones, more architecture, which is another kind of thing I talked about in the intro, right? This is more so where the VR setting is being used. This could also kind of be for military, although they would probably have something a little bit different. And so this is ultimately like where a lot of the power and money of virtual reality is going, and augmented reality is this kind of industry specialized work. And you can obviously see that because of things like the HoloLens and what it's being used for. But you may also say, hey, that's not the only player in the game that's spending a bunch of money on virtual reality. And you're absolutely correct. Because Meta is also doing it by a lot. Meta's losing a lot of money on virtual reality, very clearly. And because they're losing a lot of money on virtual reality, about $1 billion a month, give or take, you may think, okay, they're losing a lot of this money. What is it going towards? And the answer is it's going towards propping up a bunch of Meta-funded games that might not actually be a natural growth of the market. So fundamentally, the reason I brought up the development stuff is because development is complicated in a way that I've hopefully been able to explain, where it takes a lot of time and a lot of thinking, a lot of trial and error to come up with these solutions problems. A lot of people and a lot of game devs that might not have to worry about this as much because of their team size or whatever, right? Ultimately might dip out of the VR space because of these challenges. And the reason I kind of say this is because what we're not seeing in this space right now is natural growth of VR development, I would say. The most popular things are the things that have been here since day one. And the things that are being announced, like the Batman game, and the Asgard's Wrath 2 game, and some other ones, are all funded by Meta, or all owned by Meta, and Meta funded by some way. That ultimately means it ultimately kind of presents itself as a stagnation of the industry, which is especially concerning when you see Meta is spending that $1 billion a month, and you're saying, okay, well, they're spending all this money. What is it going towards? Well, not only is it going towards things like the Meta Quest 3 and that mixed reality sort of device development, it's also going towards Horizon Worlds, which is a more social-focused platform. And so when you're not going towards something like medical or something like military, you're going towards a Horizon World sort of like meeting space where people can talk and meet, and so that's kind of what Horizon World is. And the reason they're going for that is because you're able to make a lot on advertising and a lot on potential customizations for avatar and just all the stuff you'd expect, as well as data and stuff that you can't really do when you're just making a game. And so ultimately, when you're stuck with Meta doing this for billions of dollars and also funding and releasing ads and stuff for the games that they're making, you don't see a lot of space for much else. Because Meta is funding these games, they're promoting those games and they're promoting the world and they're promoting this idea that our OS is open and you can start developing on it. But that's not really moving things, moving games, moving experiences, right? It's even worse on the experience side. Like as people say, and I say, oh, there's not any good VR games, and I'll give you examples of why. There's also not really any good experiences on Quest or on VR in general. Like obviously there's stuff like Wanderer and things. I think it's called Wanderer. Yeah, it's called like Wander. That's pretty popular. Brink is another one. These are basically just like sightseeing apps. Yeah, Brink is right here. There's a couple meditation ones, but like ultimately these are traveling. They show you like a Google Earth kind of thing that you pay $15 for, and people love it. But the experiences are also worse. Netflix and stuff isn't that fun because you still have a big hunking headset on your face, and it doesn't look super clear, and you're not getting the greatest quality of resolution or audio or really anything, and it's still a 2D screen. Like, there's not a bunch of reason to kind of do that for a lot of places. And so when your apps are subpar and your games are subpar, what you ultimately have, and what I think a lot of people might be using their Quest for, the occasional game, right? People still play things like Beat Saber, which is, I'm going to just call its own category of fitness games, because I think that's actually really important to understand where we're going, right? We have stuff that people continuously play, like Beat Saber, like a social platform like VR chat, and that's really where I see this going. Which it's already there, so I'm not saying it's going, but this is kind of where it's being focused on. You're either in VR on a consistent basis where it would matter to anyone, in a social platform like VR chat, in a social platform like Horizon Worlds, or in a fitness platform like Beat Saber, or something like Supernatural, which is a more Peloton style, Zumba style class where you have practicing boxing and Beat Saber like motions and meditation, stretching, having daily challenges and achievements and on demand live skills, coaching, all that kind of gym membership like stuff in VR, and it's about like $10 a month after you buy the game for like $30, I think. Having like free membership if you're same headset, like everyone in the headset's allowed to basically use it, right? So that's kind of all part of this idea that's like, oh, it's a gym membership, but it's in virtual reality, and that's kind of a thing you can do every day, and that kind of makes it worth it. And so we have stuff like that, stuff like Les Mis Body Combat XR, which is also similar. This one's more geared towards Quest 3, as it's like more mixed reality, but it's also similar, kind of like running in place and all that focus. It's also on the Pico and the PlayStation VR 2 as well. And there's also a normal version of it that's not XR, I guess, not mixed reality. But those are two different things than games. People are playing those every day or a consistent basis because they're fitness and because that's where they get their fitness from. They're not playing, Contractor Showdown or Creed or The Climb 2 or Homeworld or Small Land or Cooking Simulator VR or Population 1 or I Expect You to Die 2 puzzle games. Stuff like Resident Evil 4, people buy because, oh, it's cool, it's in VR, it's a great, port of this thing, but like, it's not where it's going, and it's not where VR shines, and I think a lot of people know that. You're not going to go into I Expect You to Die 2 and be like, oh my god, this was incredible. It's a puzzle game, right? It's a fun, I move my thing with my hand and move this other thing with my hand, and kind of, like, I'm, oh my god, look how much fun I'm having. Wow, I can drink this thing. It's like, that's not really what we're aiming towards. I don't think anyone's really aiming towards that, right? So you kind of just get lost in this thing of like, wow, look at this. And there's only so many, wow, look at this you can do after 4 years. And so that's why people tend to gravitate towards these more fitness experiences, especially something like Beat Saber. And I would even say Beat Saber is one of those ones where it's like, yeah, this is similar to our fitness ones, something you could see yourself doing on a frequent basis. And there just hasn't been anything like that to really get people to do it. And I'm not saying that every VR experience needs to be like that, and every game in VR needs to be like that, but there needs to be something like that. Something that people talk about, at least one thing. In all the time since 2016, when the Rift came out, what do people talk about? What is the thing that's like, oh, I'm playing VR, what are you doing? They're playing Beat Saber. They're on VR chat. They're doing Supernatural, right? They're not doing anything else at all to any extent that it would matter even a little bit. And so the reason why there's no good VR games is because that's not the focus, and that's not where they shine, and that's not where they should be pouring their money into. If you want something like this to be successful, you either need to make a quote-unquote live service like something like Beat Saber that you can continuously update and put paid DLC into, or you need to get into the Microsoft game. You need to get into that healthcare or that other space that lets you do it at a more high level for this industry to even be something that people care about at all. That was really made apparent when I went to finish off the experience that we're making here, and while the person that was reviewing it was very happy about all the progress we made and all that, their main focus was, do you know about the HoloLens and what they're doing with medical stuff in that simulation? Is that something that you're thinking of doing? And that really kind of hit it. And I'm like, absolutely. That's something that we know about, and that's something that, is very prominent while we're thinking about this. But, those headsets are very expensive, and that's an industry thing, and that's kind of where the current of this is going. That's not us. And you kind of have to understand that in order to understand where VR is right now. VR is in a great spot right now. It's just not here. It's in the healthcare, it's in the military, it's in the architecture, it's in the plumbing. It's all these things that are not focuses for consumers, and that's where you kind of lose people. That's why we're not growing, is because you end up getting, the focus on this isn't really something that we should be focusing on, generally speaking. So, hope all that made sense and I didn't ramble for too long. I'll see everyone in the next video.